What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, the 2018 Innovation Award winner, given out by CIMA, the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. As always, I like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. And we always like to have new friends on the Dr. Vibe Show. We have another new friend tonight. We finally were able to cross paths digitally after some, I'd say, hiccups, but it's all good. So I'd like to just share a little bit about him first. His name is Andrew Griffith. He's the author and immigration expert at MIREMS Limited. MIREMS stands for Multicultural International Research and Ethnic Media Services. And that organization brings decades of experience in Canada's multicultural spheres. Together, they illustrate the power and potential diverse Canadian voters have with information that has been traditionally hidden behind linguistic and bureaucratic barriers. And why do we have Andrew on tonight? Well, for those of you who live in Canada, you should know. And for those who don't live in Canada, yeah, you should know also. On October 21st, there is another federal election coming up in Canada, a national election. And Canada is known as a mosaic, and about 22 to 23% of Canadians are known as minorities or identify themselves as minorities. And Andrew is part of an organization called Diversity Votes, and their purpose is to fill the gaps in understanding between Canada's diverse communities, the media they listen to, read and watch, and how they can affect and how they will cast their ballot in the upcoming federal election. So we'd like to say thank you so much and welcome for the first time and hopefully not the last time, Mr. Andrew Griffith. How are you, sir?
Very good. Thanks very much for the invite.
My pleasure. So your time is always limited because I know you're always on the go and you're a demographic and numbers guy, so I'm going to keep it tight as much as possible. Just a little background of yourself. How did you get into this journey of studying ethnicity, diversity in Canada?
Pretty long roundabout way, in fact. I mean, I'm former public servant, and I spent time abroad working for the government in various embassies, spent time in different government departments in Ottawa, and then I sort of ended up being responsible for citizenship and multiculturalism at the immigration department. And when I retired, I just found the issues interesting. So I just decided I'd keep on doing some work on my own, doing some analysis on my own, and really sort of allow myself to have a deeper understanding of the issues that had interested me when I was finishing up my career.
And when you decided to continue this journey, did you think that you'd still be doing it for as long as you have been?
Well, I mean, there's also a backstory, is that I had to do early retirement given that I had a cancer treatment for pretty aggressive form of cancer. So I wasn't quite sure, quite frankly, how long I would have to do this thing. So I started doing short-term projects, and as my treatments kept on working, I just sort of did more and more and more. So it sort of evolved very organically and stage by stage. And then I would, still be healthy. I say, well, there's another project I want to work on, another issue I want to look at.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you've overcome the cancer. I'm glad to hear that you're still with us and you're looking good.
I am. Thank you.
Good stuff. Can you tell our audience a little bit about MIREMS? To be honest, I had not heard about the organization until recently.
Well, I mean, it's kind of funny because when I was in government working on multiculturalism and citizenship issues, we used to get a daily ethnic media scan, which I had to read as part of my job. And that was my introduction to MIREMS, because they've been producing that largely for government clients, not exclusively government clients. But that sort of became sort of the go-to source for getting a sense of what are some of the conversations that are happening within the different ethnic communities as expressed by their media. And they've been doing this, I think, for about 20, 30 years, if I remember correctly. And they have about a network, I think about 50 consultants that basically scour the ethnic media sources every day and then summarize and package them in different reports for different clients. And so when I was doing the data analysis, because as you mentioned, I like the data, Um, I was looking for somebody to help me get it out there because the data interests me, but for a lot of people, it's sort of a bit dry and a bit dull. So how do you make it more interesting? And so uh, Miriam's actually approached me when they heard what I was doing, and then we had some discussions in terms of how could we create a platform where we could match the dry data, the demographic data, the socio-economic data, with some of the stories that are happening within the different communities tied to the election, of course, because that's a good anchor for it. So that's how it evolved, and we've been working at this for the better part of a year, and and so now it's up and running, and we're putting more and more content on the website as we go on.
Excellent. If there was any challenge in launching diversity votes, were there any challenges? Was there a timing factor? Because obviously an election coming up probably was time sensitive and getting this all together at the right time.
Well, one of the things is the joys of having a deadline is you have to meet it. If we had it ready on October the 22nd, it wouldn't be of much interest to anybody. So that really sort of forced a bit of discipline. There were like any project, there are a lot of challenges. I mean, funding remains an ongoing challenge, of course. We had challenges getting the database up and running the way we wanted. The website, we keep on sort of refining it as we go along. Starting a system where we have regular new content on the site took some time. But these are the kind of, normal challenges you'd probably expect in starting off a new project. I'm sure when you started your show, you had some challenges that sound very familiar, right?
Yes, still have them once in a while. So that is great. Now, for a lot of our viewers, and I'm blessed to have international viewers, can you give a little background about the percentage of Canada's population that is recognize themselves as minority?
Well, yeah, in Canada, it's sort of the term we use is visible minorities, which of course is, other people use racialized minorities or people of color. So it's about 20% of the population, and we have large levels of immigration. So that means roughly about 80% of the immigrants that are coming to Canada these days are from visible minorities, with the largest groups probably being Chinese, Filipino, and from India.
Now, in regards to this upcoming election, one of the things we talked about beforehand was the whole word of populism. Our neighbors to the south, it's a very big issue. What have you found out in your research about the aspect or how important or how much of a factor populism will be in this upcoming vote?
Well, that's the big question. And there are people who write that it's not going to be that important. Other people who write it is going to be very significant. I think I would distinguish between the different types of populism. I think one type of populism that seems to be relatively resilient to, almost immune to, is anti-immigration populism. Because if you look at sort of the major parties, three major parties, they're all basically pro-immigration. There's a difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals and the NDP, of course. The Liberals and NDP probably favor a more open approach. The Conservatives favor a more restrictive approach. But it's within a certain relatively narrow range. We don't have the Liberals have increased the levels of immigration. Maybe the Conservatives would reduce it slightly, but still compared to most Western countries, our immigration levels are high in relation to the percentage of the population. And sort of the one party that has an explicitly sort of, I would call it anti-immigration stance. Others would sort of nuance that a bit more. The People's Party of Canada, of Maxime Bernier, it doesn't seem to be getting much traction in the polls. It's about 2 to 3%, I think, at the last one. I mean, that could change, but the people who are likely to vote for PPC are probably coming from the same people who were more likely to vote conservative, because there's more concerns about immigration levels among conservatives. So it's hard to see that there's a real groundswell of that kind of anti-immigration populism. Now, of course, there's always the possibility that there's a whole bunch of voters out there that traditionally haven't voted and it attracts it, but we haven't seen much traction to date. The other thing I would say is when we look at sort of recent examples of populism at the provincial level, so we take Doug Ford in Ontario, very clearly economic populism and other forms of maybe social populism, but he's not into anti-immigrant. There's no sort of real anti-immigration messages coming out of them. There are fights with the feds in terms of who pays for what, but that's normal Fed-Prov relations. And the other example, of course, is Jason Kenney in Alberta. And again, I think economically you could classify him as a populist. But I mean, he's the mastermind between all the outreach the Conservative Party did with the various minority groups, and has very close contacts with all the key players in the minority groups. And so he's not anti-immigration. So I don't really see that as a major issue, because between the Conservatives and the Liberals, there are differences, there are significant differences, but it's not like shut it down versus open the floodgates. It's more within a certain range. And Quebec, of course, is it's a completely different situation, but we can talk about that later. But I think overall, that's how I see it.
You were so great just to share some information with me before we went live. And one of the things that stuck out in my mind was federal election has 338 total writings, 41 visible majority minority, 93 20 to 50% visible majority minority. That blew my mind. I knew our country was diverse, but not that diverse.
Yeah, and we think about it, there's the big cities, but when you're getting to those kind of numbers, you're actually hitting smaller cities. And if you even take it further, if you look at ridings where there's sort of between 5 to 20% visible minorities, those are still significant pockets. There's another 95. So it's really sort of spread across the country. And so that's why I always argue that our electoral system, in one sense, means that if you want to win power, and certainly if you want to have a majority government, you can't be anti-immigrant. You can be critical of some immigration policies. You can be maybe anti-refugee, but you can't be anti the middle class, visible minorities living in Brampton or Mississauga or elsewhere.
Right. But isn't that being a very fine tightrope? Because you can be against the policy, but some people say, well, if you're against the policy, that means you're against the people that the policy affects.
I think it's very easy sometimes to conflate the two.
Right.
And sometimes it's because, sometimes there are some people where they may make the arguments based on the specific policies where it's really driven by more baser motives for the sake of argument. In other cases, it may be that how the concerns are expressed may give the impression that it's more xenophobia than substantive reasons. And in other cases, it may just be that that there are some legitimate concerns. And I'll use the example that sometimes I use so what is the level? How many immigrants should we admit per year in Canada? So the current government, has a multi-year plan, which is a good idea. And they keep on ratcheting up every year. And I think it's 320,000 for this year, something like that. Well, you can have an intelligent discussion whether that's the right number or whether the old number of around 280,000 is a more appropriate number without being necessarily anti-immigrant or xenophobic, because you can sort of say, well, it's the absorptive capacity, ability to integrate people, it's the infrastructure needs of the increased population, it's the impact on housing prices. So you can have those discussions. So I think whenever, and I have to, watch myself on this, is being too quick to label a concern as racism, xenophobia, or anti-immigrant feeling, and really try and understand what's going on underneath.
Right.
In some cases, it may well be, but I don't. I think. Well, let me phrase it another way, if I may.
Sure.
So Keith Manting is one of the leading theorists of multiculturalism and integration in Canada. And he divides the Canadian population into thirds, and it's a simplification, but it works. So you have 1/3 who are pro-immigration, 1/3 who have concerns about immigration, and there's the mushy middle. Most Canadians say, "Oh yeah, sounds about right," blah blah blah. And so the question is then, if you're having a discussion on immigration policy levels or whatever, do you just go for the people in the middle if you're trying to advocate for more immigration, which is sort of one argument, because you've got 1/3 you've got on your side, so you aim for the people in the middle. I've often been a bit reticent for that approach, because if I look at the 1/3 who have concerns, I'm saying there's a range of people who have concerns. And the range includes the people who are xenophobic, but it also includes people who just may have some practical concerns, or they're worried about one issue or another. And I think you shouldn't just limit yourself to the people in the mushy middle, but you should actually try and expand that mushy middle a bit for that kind of discussion, and sort of realize there are going to be extremists on the right, extremists on the left, but try and expand that center to the maximum possible.
Excellent. One of the things in the information you shared with me that I found interesting again was, unlike our neighbors to the south in the United States, ethnic groups seem to stay with their voting patterns in national elections and even state elections, and maybe local elections through and through. But your information that you've been sharing with me and with others is that ethnicities go with the flow. They can't be defined as sticking to certain parties election after election. Can you give some more insight on that?
Sure. I think the easiest example to use is probably Ontario, and you're based in Toronto, you could appreciate this.
There you go.
So traditionally, immigrant voters and visible minority voters were considered to be liberals. And for many years, in fact, that was largely the case. Then under Harper and Jason Kenney, they realized that actually if they're going to win a majority and win more seats, they have to attract the immigrant voter, the visible minority voter. And so they were successful. And so in 2011, when they won their majority, they won the vast majority of seats ridings where visible minorities were actually in the majority. But then 4 years later, the Liberals won back virtually all those seats. And then in 2018, in the provincial election, you have Doug Ford winning most of those seats which were Liberal provincially to the Conservative back. So there's that fluidity, which I think actually is really good from the point of view of Canadian political integration and the integration of visible minorities and immigrants, because it means that they're not locked down. Now, there are some overall trends. I mean, generally, if you look at sort of immigrants who have been here for a longer term tend to vote more conservative than more recent immigrants. And that may just be an age factor, because we know the overall demographics, the older you get, the greater the tendency to vote conservative. And some groups seem to have more of a tendency for one party or another. So typically Chinese Canadians tend to have a greater leaning towards the conservatives, not uniform, not everybody, I know, and Canadian Sikhs tend to be more liberal or NDP, but within each group, it's not monolithic. Not every Chinese Canadian will vote, obviously, for the Conservatives, because we have examples of ridings where there are a large number of Chinese Canadians and the Liberals were elected. So that's the kind of thing that is interesting. So it isn't locked down, as you said in your introduction. It's fairly fluid. And I think the other thing, when I sort of look at some of the work by political scientists who do much more in-depth work than I ever could do, the overall trend of the campaign applies to everybody. Mm-hmm. So if the move in 2011 was towards a conservative majority government, immigrants and visible minorities were part of that movement. And in 2015, when the reverse happened to the Liberals, it was sort of that overall election trend was affected everybody, not just, so the difference between how the, non-visible minorities were affected by the overall trend and visible minorities wasn't all that great.
Okay. With the work that Diversity Votes has done so far, what is the ethnic media talking about in regards to this election? I know it's still somewhat early, but are you getting some sort of sense of what sort of content is being put out there? Or what are they covering?
It's still the early days. And so, I get a daily feed, which I go through, and then I compile it into a weekly analysis. And I guess so I'll just sort of talk about the past 2 days. So 2 issues have been same-sex marriage, the famous video of Andrew Scheer in 2005, and the Liberal efforts to effectively change the channel and conversation away from SNC Lavalin to some perceived vulnerabilities on the Conservative side. And the other one has been the billboards, Stop Mass Immigration, that featured Bernier, even though it was done by a third party. So what I tend to see is that if there's a big issue that's being discussed in the mainstream media, it usually gets captured pretty quickly by ethnic media. But then when there's a sort of more of an ethnic media kind of thing, it gets more amplified. So I'm seeing, when I look at the amount of articles that I'm seeing on same-sex marriage, I'm saying, ooh, that seems a lot, compared to what I'm seeing in the mainstream media. And same with the billboards, because they pick it up because it has a resonance. Right. And the other example that was sort of earlier on, which gets lost in the midst of time, was the election date and the Jewish holiday.
Yes. Yeah.
And for a few weeks, it was almost the largest focus of ethnic media that I was seeing. More so than it got more coverage in one sense in the ethnic media relative to other stories than what I was seeing in the mainstream media.
Nice. In your years of research, are there particular core issues that are of importance to the ethnic vote, or is that fluid, or with different ethnicities, there are different core issues?
Well, I think there's some issues that are just issues of interest to all Canadians, whatever their origin, no matter how long they've been here. So, the economy is always an issue. Housing prices are an issue. Healthcare is an issue. Where you tend to have more specific issues, obviously, is with relation to anything touching with immigration, because that affects people. Family reunification, for example, is always a hot spot. But other immigration issues are common, like refugees who cross the border, the asylum seekers. That's not necessarily an issue just for immigrants, because it comes down in the perception, it's the management of the immigration system. It's are people perceived to be playing by the rules, coming through the appropriate channels? And that's something that probably doesn't have too much division of opinion between immigrants and visible minorities and non-immigrants, because it's sort of one of those integrity issues. Whereas family reunification, because people want to bring their relatives over and everything like that, it's a more personal one and may have more resonance among the different communities. And I had the sense in the 2015 election that the Liberal commitment to ease family reunification had a certain degree of resonance in those 905 ridings with large number of immigrants and visible minorities. So I think there's the general bread and butter issues, for lack of a better, apply to everybody. And probably the other issues that there's sort of different sensitivities is in relation to foreign policy issues. So how should we deal with China? How should we deal with the situation in Hong Kong? How do we deal with Ukraine and Russia? Venezuela, whatever, because there are communities, it becomes very important for the government to sort of have to understanding where the communities are coming from, and how does it actually make a decision that either the communities will be happy with or won't be happy with, either way.
Nice. Early on in our conversation, you mentioned the province of Quebec.
Yeah.
And some things that are going on there in regards to dress code.
Yeah.
And how much of an impact do you think that could be federally in the upcoming election? Do you think the federal parties will address that issue?
I think all three of them, are basically saying the minimum possible, expressing their opposition, sort of saying it's not appropriate and everything like that, but not making it a high profile issue, because the NDP is trying to salvage whatever seats it has in Quebec. The Conservatives are trying to gain some seats. The Liberals are also trying to gain some seats. And so I think they're being very coy, rather than sort of making a big issue of it. And I'm not comfortable with that approach, but I can understand the rationale when the election is 2 months away, and that how you do in Quebec could determine whether you get a majority or not.
Right. And we're making an assumption here that everyone that's watching this live on the replay will understand. So would you be able to give a little bit of background of the Quebec dress code issue?
Okay, well, sure. Well, Quebec has been grappling with immigration and multicultural related issues for a long time. So there's always been some form of crisis in the last 10, 15 years over what is a reasonable form of accommodation for religious minorities in particular, and Muslims to be specific. So you had the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, which looked at reasonable accommodation issues about 10, 12 years ago, that tried to come up with an approach that would, put the issue to bed. And the issue was basically that officers of the state who were in positions of authority, police, judges, and the like, could not wear religious symbols of any kind. And that was their proposal, and the government at the time didn't really want to address it and sort of let it slide. And then it's been sliding. It's been in the background for some time. The PQ, Parti Québécois, when they were in power, tried to have a sort of a charter of Quebec values, but they got thrown out of the office, and you had the QR government of the Liberals, who basically just tried to ignore the issue as much as possible, put it on the back burner and not really take anything. And now you have the CAQ, Coalition Avenir Québec, which has actually then sort of passed a law prohibiting religious symbols, not only for the positions of authority like judges and police officers, but expanding it to the public sector like teachers and the like. So you have situations where, recently there's been a story about a young Sikh woman who studied in Quebec, who was moved to BC because she can't wear a turban.
I saw that.
Yeah, and the Quebec government put in invoked the notwithstanding clause so they can get away with it being charter non-compliant for 5 years.
Wow.
So it's pretty draconian, and I'm not sure it actually, helps or puts the issue to bed forever, because the people in Montreal are going to keep on running across these issues in terms of they need the staff, and some of the staff will be Muslim or Sikh or whatever.
Nice. How important, in your opinion, will the ethnic media play a role in this upcoming election when it does in regards to the diverse populations of Canada?
That's the big question that I really don't know. I mean, I have a belief that it is significant in terms of when I look at sort of the number of ethnic media outlets, the kind of content they produce, and the fact that the politicians do interviews with ethnic media because they obviously view that it's a way of getting their message out. But whether it has a large impact in particular communities or not, like, I'm a data guy. I'd love to have some real metrics, but I just don't have any, but I mean, I think if you look at the behavior of politicians, that says that it's not negligible anyway.
Right.
That if you're trying to attract voters to, in the Chinese Canadian community or the Filipino Canadian community, you automatically have to reach out to their media as part of your way of engaging with the population.
Right. In launching Diversity Votes, what are your goals, or what is the mandate you put out there that you're looking to achieve? And will it be something that runs past the election?
Okay, well, I think one of the first things we were just trying to do is increase the understanding and awareness of the conversations that happen within the ethnic media and within the communities. But the broader objective, in one sense, is really to improve the transparency of what's happening. So we don't want situations where a politician is saying one thing to one group and another to another group. So if we make the information more widely available, it basically provides a degree of accountability that, yes, if I said that to the Chinese media, and I said this to the Punjabi media, and there's a contradiction, well, they'll find out, and that'll sort of help discipline that. And we also saw, in the Burnaby South election this February, there was a famous incident where the first Liberal candidate says, "Vote for me, I'm Chinese. Don't vote for Jagmeet Singh, he's Indian." I mean,
you're kidding.
Yeah, it was that.
Oh my goodness.
She had to resign, within 24 hours, obviously. So, and it's rare that you get that kind of gaffe, but if the information is more widely available, if everybody can see it and everybody knows that it can be seen, it should, ideally, and that's the longer term objective, is improve the accountability both of the ethnic media as well as the politicians in their messaging in the ethnic media.
Right.
And as to your second question, in terms of whether it goes on, we're not quite sure yet. We'll see how it goes, and we'll take it from there.
Excellent. Evangelos is saying here, it is impossible to be totally transparent in any business, politics included.
Oh, okay. Well, you're right. I'm not aiming for total transparency, but I am aiming for improved transparency. So hopefully that'll address it.
There you go. Absolutely. What has been the most interesting part of the journey so far in regard to diversity votes? I know it's fairly new still, but have you had any interesting aha moments as of yet?
Um, well, I guess what I'm saying, like I've been really sort of following in detail the ethnic media coverage just for the last 6 weeks or so. That's when I get my
Right.
feed. And I guess my main aha moment is that I'm not seeing many issues that are in the mainstream media not getting coverage in the ethnic media. So,
Oh,
it does reflect the overall political conversations. Now, in general, they're not as in depth, they're not as researched because these are smaller organizations; they don't have the same resources. The other thing that I'm trying to think about and look for, and this is the harder one, is what's missing, and in the sense of what isn't being covered,
right.
and so or is being less covered. And the one that I seem to be seeing, and it's still early days, is sort of the situation in Hong Kong and the tension between
Yeah.
Chinese Canadians from the mainland versus Hong Kong seems to be undercovered in relation to what I'm seeing in the mainstream media. And I may not be seeing everything, so it may be an oversimplification, but those are the kind of things that it's easy to see what's in. And I always try and read a lot of the mainstream media to sort of keep in mind, okay, what isn't there?
Okay. Have you seen any coverage of it in the Chinese media?
There's been some coverage of it in relation to sort of the challenge of for the government, but it's more, and again, I'm getting a feed that's more election related, so there may be some
Right.
stories that are there. So there's been some coverage, but compared to the degree of coverage that I'm seeing in the mainstream media, it's much less.
Why do you feel that there should be more coverage of it?
Well, there
Because
there are,
some ethnic media will say, okay, so for example, let's take an African Canadian
yeah.
media. What do you is there a need? Do you feel they should be covering it? Or is it ethnic based content more say than? But I agree with you. I think it's something that all Canadians should be paying attention to.
Well, I think it would be interesting to see more coverage of China Hong Kong issues in Canadian Chinese media,
Yeah.
because it's clearly a very divisive issue between the two groups. We're having protests here. There are there do seem to be some signs that the Chinese government is sort of playing some form of role with some of the groups. So that's one that I think is, and it may just be that it's just too sensitive issue for the community, and it may also reflect some of the influence of the Chinese government in some of those discussions. It's hard to say, but there certainly are articles in mainstream media that are highlighting Chinese intervention or efforts to steer the conversation one way or rather than another.
Right. Another conversation point I want to bring up. We had talked about earlier on in Canada how the ethnic groups don't stay attached to any political party. What has your research shown in regards to how much they show up at the ballot box? Is that a fluctuating thing also?
That's been improving. So I don't have the numbers on the top of mind.
Sure.
But in the last election, the 2015 election, the difference between Canadian-born, longer-term immigrants and recent immigrants was relatively small. I think it was
That's good.
2 to 3%. Maybe it was a bit more than that, but it shrunk a lot. The difference between recent, like the traditional biggest difference was recent immigrants versus longer-term or Canadian-born, and that shrunk dramatically in 2015 compared to 2011.
Okay.
And that probably reflects in part some of the get out the vote efforts. In particular, I believe Muslim Canadians made a major effort in terms of getting out the vote, and to get out the Muslim vote, and so that percentage increased fairly dramatically. So that may have played a part too. So, and we'll see this election whether that trend continues or not. We'll see.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start winding it down here to let you get up. Make sure you get up for that 4:45 wake up call. What are you wanting to see diversity votes achieve but when we get up in the morning on October 22nd? Best case scenario, what do you want to say that your organization achieved?
Well, I think we'll have the standard metrics that that you have with your show in terms of tweets and retweets and data. But I mean, apart from that, I think the real thing is that if there's a greater awareness among everybody of the role the ethnic media plays in the communities, and that this role is actually part of Canadian integration, it's not something separate. And that there's been greater attention by everybody in terms of what one is saying to one group versus another group.
Right.
But it's very hard to sort of say, like, how will I be able to sort of say we definitely achieved that? I really don't know. And I used to do performance management, but I haven't figured out what the indicator is. But I think my sense is when I talk to people in the media in terms of what we're doing, is they recognize there's a bit of a blind spot here.
Yes.
And so hopefully some of the material we're providing will help them at least address their blind spot and hopefully beyond that.
Excellent. So if people want to find out more information with diversity votes, what can they do or where can they go?
Okay, well, don't remember this, diversityvotes.ca. All one word, and then .ca. And go to the website, check it out, look up your riding, see the characteristics of your riding. There's a lot of data there that, like I'm a data guy, so I probably put too much data in there. But it's got everything from the demographics to the economic characteristics to housing and everything like that. And take a look at that. Look at some of the stories. Look at the weekly analysis we're doing. Look at some of the thematic pieces we're doing. And let us know. Provide us feedback. If there's something you think we're missing, let us know, because we always want to improve. And, it's a bit like, your show, we need the feedback to make it better.
Absolutely.
And of course, if you've got some money in your pocket to spare, we'll always take a donation to help us do more stories.
There you go. Well, look, I'd like to thank you for taking time in your positive, productive schedule to share with us about this important initiative in Canada, but also worldwide. It's very important. I'm all going to put it out there. I would love to have you come back closer to the election date if you have some time to provide us updates on what's going on with ethnic news coverage, diversity, and the election coming up. You're more than welcome to share that and come back with us when you have time.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, and I'll probably take you up on that.
I'm looking forward to it. I am Dr. Vibe, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show 2018, Canadian Ethnic Media Association Innovation Award winner. If you want to find out any information about me, very simple. Just go to my website, www.thedrvibeshow.com. As always, I'd like to say thank you for watching live on the replay. I always close out my conversation saying, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Also, sometimes you have to get small to get stronger. Block assumptions. And then finally, aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. If you are in Canada, whether you're ethnic or not, biggest thing, go and vote. That's the most important thing. Ethnic or non-ethnic, every vote counts. No matter what party, every vote counts. God bless, peace, well, keep the faith, and walk good. And thanks for watching. Good night.